While I sit here sewing tiny Liberty Tana lawn hexagons together by hand, Jane Austen once spent her own quiet evenings doing much the same thing beside her mother and sister Cassandra, carefully piecing together fragments of fabric into patchwork that still survives today. Their patchwork was made from tiny diamond-shaped pieces arranged into delicate geometric patterns of soft creams, florals and printed cottons. There is something deeply satisfying about very small stitches, perhaps because they ask something increasingly rare of us now: patience, quiet attention, the willingness to sit with something for hours simply because the process itself is pleasurable. I've been working on tiny hexagons in Liberty Tana lawn prints, joining them together slowly by hand to make little flowers for a patchwork quilt. English paper piecing is one of those methods where slowness is not a flaw in the process, it's the whole point of it. Each piece is wrapped carefully around paper, folded precisely, stitched with tiny hidden stitches one side at a time. There's no rushing it successfully. The pleasure comes from surrendering to the rhythm of it. And I think that maybe one reason patchwork has endured for centuries, not simply because patchwork covers or quilts are useful, although they are, but because patchwork turns fragments into something lasting. I always find myself becoming absorbed in the choosing of fabrics, deciding which prints belong beside one another, whether two florals clash or quietly harmonize, whether a pale pink should sit beside a brighter one, or whether it needs a darker print nearby to ground it. Tiny floral prints seem especially suited to patchwork. There's something very English about them. They remind me of cottage gardens, old chintzes, summer dresses, scraps saved carefully in sewing baskets for years. And because Liberty prints have already been part of garments I've made and worn, they already carry memories with them before they even became part of a patchwork. I can remember where some of them came from immediately: a dress worn on a summer day, a blouse made during winter evenings, leaving small remnants too pretty to throw away. I've always felt that fabric keeps traces of life within it somehow, not literally, but emotionally, and women have understood this for generations. Long before modern conversations about sustainability or anti-consumerism, women were quietly keeping things, saving ribbons, scraps, buttons, pieces of lace, lengths of fabric too beautiful or too useful to waste. Not because it was a trend, but because beauty and usefulness mattered, and because making something from what already existed was understood as a kind of care. That same instinct existed in the world of Jane Austen. Jane Austen, her mother and her sister Cassandra stitched a patchwork you can still see now in Jane Austen's house centuries later. Tiny fabric scraps cut into diamonds and carefully hand-stitched together during the quiet domestic hours of ordinary life. I love imagining those moments, the conversations that might have unfolded while pieces were stitched together, the familiarity of hands busy with work that had become almost instinctive, the satisfaction of turning scraps into something both useful and beautiful, the There's sometimes a tendency now to imagine domestic work as small or limiting, but I don't think these women would necessarily have seen it that way. Within those domestic spaces, they were creating beauty, usefulness, comfort, identity and memory, and perhaps something else too, continuity. Because when you keep things carefully enough, you begin quietly resisting a culture of disposal. Patchwork has always carried that spirit within it, beauty from remnants, something warm and lasting created from what might otherwise have been discarded. And my mother understood that too, because on my bed is a quilt she made from the fabrics of my childhood. Pieces saved from the cutting out of old dresses, my childhood dresses, my mother's own dresses from the 1950s, 60s and 70s, curtains from our home, familiar prints that once belonged to the ordinary texture of everyday life. I remember a dress sewn from the red roses fabric that I was especially pleased with. It's extraordinary, really, how fabric can collapse time. You see one print and suddenly an entire room returns to you. The colour and print of childhood curtains, a favourite dress, the feeling of being small. And so this quilt became much more than bedding. It became memory stitched into cloth. And every time I look at it, I think about the fact that women have been doing this exact thing for generations, keeping fragments, preserving beauty, refusing to throw away the emotional life attached to ordinary objects. I sometimes think patchwork covers or quilts are among the most intimate things women make, because unlike paintings or ornaments, they are used daily. You live with them, sleep beneath them, carry them through decades of ordinary life. And perhaps that's why they become so emotionally charged over time, because they witness life quietly. This patchwork cover especially feels almost like a family document, not in words, but in fabric. A record of domestic life, colour, memory and creativity. And there's something profoundly comforting about sleeping beneath pieces of your own childhood, transformed into something protective and warm. Again, I find myself thinking of Jane, Cassandra and their mother. Their patchwork came from exactly the same impulse. These things matter. These remnants should not simply disappear. Keep them close. Keep beauty close. Keep memory close. And perhaps that quiet philosophy has become slightly radical now, because modern life encourages constant replacement, newness over continuity, disposal over preservation. But patchwork asks us to value what already exists, to look again at what remains. And perhaps that is why sewing by hand still feels so grounding. It slows the mind enough to notice things again. And perhaps that's why, after spending the morning sewing patchwork and thinking about Jane Austen and the quiet domestic world she shared with the women around her, it felt only natural to leave the cottage for a few hours and visit one of the great English manor house gardens nearby, because Austen's world was always balanced between these two things: the intimacy of drawing rooms, sewing baskets and tea tables, and then the wider landscape beyond them, long walks, gravel paths, sweeping views, roses climbing warm stone walls, and the great houses that appear throughout novels like Pride and Prejudice. After hours spent concentrating on tiny stitches and carefully saved scraps of fabric, stepping out into those expansive gardens felt almost like walking briefly into the landscape of the novels themselves. There is something about an English country house garden that feels deeply connected to the world of Jane Austen, not because Jane herself lived in grand houses like Pemberley, but because landscapes matter so much in her novels. Journeys, walks, views unfolding slowly, moments of reflection taking place outdoors. And so leaving the cottage with sewing still waiting on the table felt rather like setting out on a small expedition. The gardens were full of clipped topiary and long sweeping views over the countryside. Roses climbing old stone walls, gravel paths curving away behind hedges. The sort of landscape that seems designed for lingering conversation. It's impossible not to think of scenes from Pride and Prejudice in places like this. Elizabeth Bennet arriving at Pemberley and finding the landscape unexpectedly beautiful. That moment when thinking about Mr. Darcy, where character and landscape seem to merge together. Austen understood very well that surroundings shape emotional life, and these great houses still carry traces of that older rhythm somehow, a slower pace, an attention to beauty, the idea that gardens are not simply decorative, but restorative. Even the scale of the views change your thoughts slightly. There's a feeling of a spaciousness, of breathing differently. And perhaps that is why these landscapes continue to fascinate us now, especially when modern life often feels so hurried and compressed. I always find myself paying attention to details in old gardens, the way roses soften stone, the slight irregularity of old pathways. Topiary shaped patiently over decades. Gardens themselves are another form of slow making or slow living really, not created instantly, but gradually, season after season. And then eventually it was time to return home. Back through my cottage door, back to the waiting patchwork pieces, the dogs soon asleep again, entirely unconcerned with philosophical thoughts about domestic history, and as dusk begins to fall, the rabbits become livelier. There's something wonderfully peaceful about animals settling into the rhythm of evenings indoors. And the rabbits become sleepier, the room grows quieter somehow, more tea is poured. The sewing is back in my hands, and this may be my favourite part of the day, really. The feeling of returning, the patchwork growing slowly, piece by piece, while the cottage becomes still around me. I think this is why hand sewing continued to matter to so many women. Not because it's efficient, not because it saved time, quite the opposite, but because it asks us to participate in a different rhythm entirely, one based on care rather than speed, attention rather than urgency, preservation rather than disposal. A patchwork quilt made slowly from saved scraps may seem like a very small thing in the modern world, but perhaps that's precisely why it matters. Because every tiny saved scrap quietly refuses wastefulness. Every hand stitch refuses haste. Every piece of a patchwork says, this was worth keeping. And across centuries, women have continued making that same quiet choice with needle and thread. Jane Austen and Cassandra and their mother, my mother, and now me, sitting here adding another tiny Liberty Tana lawn hexagon to the growing patchwork, while evening settles around the cottage. The same act continuing, women keeping fragments of life and turning them into something lasting, something warm, something beautiful, something that remains.